Did your parents ever isolate you from the world? It started when I was 12, and my mom found me talking to a friend online. She spent 3 hours lecturing me about digital predators and how the internet was destroying children's minds. The next day, she installed monitoring software on every device and canceled our internet plan entirely. Real knowledge comes from books, not screens, she said, while boxing up our TV, tablets, and my phone. Dad tried to argue, but she shut him down, saying she was protecting my developing brain. The restrictions escalated every few weeks. First, it was no technology at all. Then no books published after 1950 because modern literature corrupts young minds. She started homeschooling me with textbooks from the 1920s she'd found at estate sales. Current events are manufactured to create anxiety, she'd tell me. You don't need to know about the outside world. When I turned 13, she added new rules. No friends who attended public school because they were contaminated by propaganda. Then no friends at all because peer influence disrupts proper development. She'd joined this group called Pure Minds Initiative that met in the basement of an old church every Tuesday. She'd come back with binders full of research about how modern society was poisoning children through social interaction. They're teaching me to raise you properly, she'd tell Dad, away from toxic influences. By 14, I wasn't allowed to leave our property. Mom had built this whole educational system using only materials approved by Pure Minds. I was learning Latin and Greek, but didn't know who the current president was. I could recite Shakespeare, but had never heard of social media. She installed blackout curtains, so I couldn't even see the neighbors. Soundproofed my room so I couldn't hear the outside world. Sensory purity, she called it. Your mind needs to develop without contamination. One night, I snuck out and followed her to the Pure Minds meeting. Through the basement window, I saw dozens of parents watching a presentation about cognitive isolation protocols. The speaker was explaining how children exposed to modern society would never reach their pure potential, how they needed to be completely separated until age 21 when their minds were properly formed. Mom was taking detailed notes about something called Phase 3, complete isolation in rural compounds where children would have zero contact with the outside world. I researched Pure Minds on a library computer I snuck to use. They were a cult that believed modern civilization was a disease. They ran isolated camps where they sent resistant children for purification. Kids who went there came back completely broken, unable to function in normal society. When I was 15, Mom announced I was ready for advanced development. 3 men from Pure Minds came to evaluate me. They asked bizarre questions about my thoughts, my dreams, whether I ever wondered about the outside world. He's showing signs of contamination, one of them told my mother. He needs immediate intervention at our facility in Montana, 6 months minimum, possibly years. Tonight, they said, the longer we wait, the more contamination sets in. Dad finally stood up. He's not going anywhere. Mom's face twisted. Pure Minds warned me you'd resist. She showed him her phone. Remember that money you stole from your company? Either he goes to Montana or you go to prison. Dad went white. Pack his things, Mom ordered. But what she didn't know was that I'd been secretly communicating with someone for months. My older sister Rose, who Mom told me died at a Pure Minds facility 3 years ago. She was very much alive, and she was waiting outside with the FBI. The front door exploded inward with a crash that made me drop my bag. Rose stood in the doorway with 4 people in FBI jackets behind her, their badges held high. Mom's face went from angry to white in a second. The 3 Pure Minds men tried to move toward the back door, but 2 agents blocked them immediately. I couldn't move from the stairs. My sister, who died 3 years ago, was standing in my house. My dead sister was alive and she brought the FBI. One of the agents stepped forward and his voice cut through everything. He told everyone to stay calm and keep their hands visible. Mom started yelling, but he talked right over her. He separated the Pure Minds men into the living room with 1 agent watching them. Another agent took Dad into the kitchen. A 3rd agent stayed with Mom in the hallway. Rose came straight to me on the stairs. She pulled me into a hug, and I went stiff because nobody had hugged me in 3 years. She was crying and saying she was sorry over and over. She said she had to let me think she was dead. She said it was the only way to build the case safely. She said she never stopped trying to get me out. I couldn't process any of it. My brain kept repeating that Rose was dead, and Rose was here, and both things couldn't be true. The lead agent came over and introduced himself as Seth Bowman. He showed me his badge and explained they had warrants for the house and for Mom's arrest. He said the 3 men were being arrested for attempted kidnapping and conspiracy. He said I was safe now. Safe was a word I didn't understand anymore. Rose kept her arm around my shoulders like she was afraid I'd disappear if she let go. Mom started screaming about parental rights and illegal search. Agent Bowman pulled out papers and showed them to her calmly. He listed the charges while she yelled over him: child abuse, false imprisonment, conspiracy to commit kidnapping. The Pure Minds men were getting handcuffed, and one of them was demanding a lawyer. The agent with him read them their rights in a flat voice like he'd done it 1,000 times. In the kitchen, Dad was talking to another agent, and his voice shook. I could hear him explaining about the embezzlement and Mom's blackmail. He kept saying he was sorry, and he should have stopped her sooner. The agent was taking notes and asking questions. Dad sounded relieved and terrified at the same time, like he'd been holding his breath for years and finally let it out, but didn't know what came next. A woman with kind eyes came over to where Rose and I sat on the stairs. Seth introduced her as his wife Temperance and said she was an FBI psychologist. She asked if we could talk in my room. Rose helped me stand because my legs felt weird. We walked up the stairs together and Temperance followed. My soundproofed room looked different with other people in it, smaller somehow. Temperance sat on my desk chair and asked if I was okay. I didn't know how to answer that. She explained what happened next in a gentle voice. I was going into temporary protective custody. They needed to sort out the legal situation with my parents. She asked about my education and my isolation. She asked what I knew about the outside world. Every question made me realize how unprepared I was. I could read Latin but didn't know how to use a phone. I could recite Shakespeare but didn't know what year it was. Rose showed me her FBI consultant badge. She explained she'd been working with them for 2 years. She said she escaped the Montana facility by pretending to be purified. She acted like they fixed her until they trusted her enough to work in their office. She copied thousands of documents before she disappeared. She'd been in witness protection this whole time, gathering evidence and waiting for the right moment to save me. I asked why she didn't come sooner. She said they needed enough evidence to shut down Pure Minds completely. If they just got me out, Mom would have sent me right back or found another facility. They needed to destroy the whole organization. I understood the logic, but 3 years felt like forever. 3 years of thinking she was dead. 3 years of being alone. Downstairs, the agents were searching the house. I heard drawers opening and boxes moving. Temperance explained they were looking for evidence. She asked more questions about Mom's isolation protocols and the Pure Minds meetings. I told her about the binders and the camera system. Her face got tight when I mentioned the cameras. She wrote everything down in a small notebook. Agent Bowman came to my door holding Mom's Pure Minds binders. He flipped through pages covered in Mom's handwriting, detailed notes about isolation protocols, plans for my Montana transport with dates and times, contact information for the facility. He said this evidence was crucial. It proved Mom's systematic abuse and her conspiracy with Pure Minds. It would help with both the criminal case and the charges against her. Another agent called up the stairs. They found the camera system hidden in my walls and ceiling. Months of footage stored on hard drives in Mom's closet. Agent Bowman said that footage would be crucial evidence too. He looked at me with something like pity and said I was very brave. I didn't feel brave. I felt like my entire world had turned inside out. A social worker arrived and Temperance introduced her. She had a kind face and a soft voice. She explained I needed to come with her to emergency foster placement. I nodded, but when she moved toward the door, my chest got tight. The hallway looked wrong. The stairs looked impossible. The front door at the bottom looked like it opened onto another planet. She reached for my arm and I jerked back. My breathing got fast and shallow. The room tilted sideways. Temperance was suddenly in front of me telling me to look at her. She counted breaths with me. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. Rose grabbed my hand and squeezed. The social worker stepped back and waited. It took 20 minutes before I could move. Temperance walked beside me down the stairs. Rose held my hand. The social worker led the way. Every step felt like walking off a cliff. The front door was open and I could see the yard, the street beyond, the world I hadn't seen in 3 years except through blackout curtains. The sunlight hit my face, and I stopped breathing again. Too bright, too open, too much space in every direction. Cars on the street, houses with windows, people walking dogs, normal things that felt completely foreign. Temperance kept talking me through breathing exercises. Rose described what we were seeing like she was narrating a nature documentary. That's Mrs. Rossi's house. That's the oak tree we used to climb. That's the corner store where we bought candy. The social worker's car sat in our driveway, a normal sedan that looked huge and threatening. I made it down the front steps by focusing on Rose's hand in mine. I made it to the car by counting steps. I made it into the back seat by closing my eyes. Rose slid in beside me, and Temperance got in the front passenger seat. The social worker started the engine, and I grabbed Rose's arm hard enough to hurt. The drive to the Bowman house was sensory overload. Even with my eyes closed, I could hear everything. Cars moving fast, music from open windows, sirens in the distance, people talking on sidewalks. Rose kept describing what we passed. We're on Main Street now. That's the library where you used to go. That's the park with the good swings. Her voice was the only thing keeping me connected to reality. When I opened my eyes, the world moved too fast. Buildings everywhere. Signs with words and pictures, traffic lights changing colors, people crossing streets, everything happening at once. My brain couldn't process it all. I closed my eyes again and focused on breathing. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The car stopped and Rose said we were here. I opened my eyes and saw a normal suburban house with a neat lawn and a basketball hoop in the driveway, the Bowman house, where I would stay temporarily. Temperance got out and opened my door. Rose helped me stand. A teenage boy stood on the front porch staring at me. Temperance introduced him as their son, Galen. He looked at me like I was from another planet, which honestly was exactly how I felt. That first night was horrible. They gave me a room upstairs with normal windows and normal curtains. The moonlight came through and lit up the whole room. Every sound made me jump. The house settling, the refrigerator humming downstairs, cars passing outside, Galen's music through the wall. I couldn't sleep. My body expected the soundproofing and blackout curtains. It expected the isolation. At midnight, I was still awake, staring at the ceiling. At 1, I got up and paced. At 2, Temperance knocked softly and asked if I was okay. I said I couldn't sleep. She didn't act surprised. She took me down to their basement guest room and hung heavy blankets over the windows. She brought a white noise machine that made ocean sounds. She said to try again. I finally fell asleep around 4 in the morning. The next day, Temperance sat with me at their kitchen table with papers and pencils. She said she needed to understand my educational level and psychological state. She asked me to read a passage in Latin, and I did it easily. She asked me to name the current president, and I said the name from Mom's 1920s textbooks. She asked me to explain how a smartphone works, and I had no idea. She asked me to recite Shakespeare, and I gave her a whole scene from Hamlet. She wrote notes the entire time. I could read ancient languages but didn't know basic geography. I understood 1920s history perfectly, but thought we were still in a different decade. I could recite classic literature but had never heard of social media. Every answer showed how completely Mom had isolated me from the real world. Temperance's face got sadder with each question. When we finished, she told me we had a lot of work to do, but I was smart and capable. I would catch up eventually. Eventually felt like a very long time away. Rose showed up the next morning with coffee and bagels from somewhere nearby. She sat at the kitchen table while I picked at the food, and she started talking about Montana. Not all at once, just small pieces. She described the building first. Gray concrete walls, small windows with bars, rooms that locked from the outside, the way sound echoed in the hallways. She talked about the schedule they kept everyone on. Wake up at 5, breakfast at 6, morning conditioning sessions that lasted 4 hours, lunch, afternoon isolation periods, dinner, evening reflection time, lights out at 8, every single day exactly the same. She came back the next day and told me more. The conditioning sessions were group meetings where they'd sit in circles and leaders would tell them their thoughts were wrong, that their memories of family were contaminated, that their feelings were symptoms of corruption. Kids who argued got sent to isolation rooms for days. Kids who stayed quiet and repeated the right phrases got rewards like extra food or books. She learned quickly to say what they wanted while keeping her real thoughts hidden deep inside. On the 3rd day, she described the isolation rooms. Tiny spaces with no windows, a mattress on the floor, a bucket in the corner, nothing else. She spent 2 weeks in one after she asked about calling home. 2 weeks of silence and darkness except when they brought food twice a day. When she came out, she was different, quieter, more careful, exactly what they wanted. She kept visiting every afternoon that first week. Each time she shared another piece of what happened there. The way they convinced kids their families didn't want them anymore. The letters they showed her supposedly from Mom saying she was disappointed and wanted Rose to stay longer. The phone calls they let her make where Mom's voice sounded cold and distant, though Rose later learned those calls were monitored and Mom was reading from scripts Pure Minds provided. After 6 months at the facility, Rose believed everything they told her. Her thoughts were contaminated. Her memories were false. Her only purpose was serving Pure Minds' vision of purity. She stopped fighting, stopped questioning, became the perfect example of their success. That's when they moved her to the administrative office to help with paperwork. She spent another year there, slowly waking up as she read files about other kids and saw the patterns, the manipulation, the lies, the money changing hands. She started copying documents secretly, hiding them, planning her escape while pretending to be their success story. Agent Seth came by the Bowman house on day 4. He sat with me in the living room while Temperance took notes nearby. He explained Pure Minds had been under federal investigation for 2 years, multiple counts of child abuse, kidnapping, fraud, racketeering. They'd been building the case carefully, gathering evidence from former members and financial records. But they needed proof of the systematic nature, the protocols, the planning. Mom's detailed notes were exactly what they needed. Those binders full of isolation techniques and Phase 3 plans showed this wasn't just individual parents making bad choices. It was organized, deliberate, criminal. The 3 men who came to evaluate me were already cooperating. They'd been arrested that first night, and within hours, they were giving statements, telling investigators about the Montana facility operations, the other locations, the leadership structure, how kids were selected for transport, what happened at the facilities. All of it documented now. Agent Seth said my case was the breakthrough that would take down the entire organization. Mom's notes proved everything. The monitoring equipment showed the surveillance. The soundproofing demonstrated the isolation. The planned Montana transport was attempted kidnapping. Combined with Rose's documentation and the evaluators' cooperation, they had enough to raid every Pure Minds facility and arrest the leadership. He thanked me for being brave enough to contact Rose, for giving them the opening they needed. Dad got arrested on day 6. Agent Seth called to let us know before it happened, the embezzlement charges, but Dad was cooperating fully with both investigations, so they released him on bail that same afternoon. He showed up at the Bowman house that evening looking exhausted and scared. Temperance let him in and sat with us while we talked. Dad tried to explain how Mom's blackmail trapped him, how she'd found out about the money he took 2 years ago, how she'd been holding it over him ever since, threatening to report him if he interfered with her Pure Minds plans. He said he was terrified of prison, terrified of losing everything. So he stayed quiet and let her do whatever she wanted with me. I sat there listening and feeling angry, really angry, because he let this happen for years. He watched her isolate me completely, watched her prepare to send me to Montana, did nothing because he was scared. I told him that, told him he chose himself over me every single time. He started crying and I didn't feel bad about it. Temperance stepped in after a while. She talked about coercive control, how Mom manipulated both of us in different ways, how fear and shame make people do things they know are wrong, how Dad was a victim too, even though he was also responsible for not protecting me. It helped a little, not enough to make me forgive him, but enough to understand the situation was complicated. Dad said he was cooperating completely with investigators, giving them everything about Mom's Pure Minds involvement, the meetings she attended, the money she donated, the plans she made. He said he knew it was too late to fix things, but he wanted to help, however he could now. Galen asked if I wanted to go to the store with him on day 8. His mom needed him to pick up some clothes for school, and he thought maybe I could get normal stuff too. I said okay, because I needed to try doing normal things eventually. The drive there was fine. Galen talked about his classes and his friends, and I mostly listened. But walking into the store was immediately wrong. The lights were too bright. Fluorescent bulbs everywhere making this buzzing sound I could feel in my teeth. People everywhere, moving fast, talking, pushing carts, music playing from speakers, signs and colors and products filling every space. Galen headed toward the clothing section and I followed, but everything felt overwhelming. Too much to look at, too many choices, too many people nearby. He started showing me shirts and asking what I liked, but I couldn't process the question. My brain was trying to handle all the input and failing. The lights kept buzzing. Someone's perfume was too strong. A baby was crying somewhere. Music kept playing. People kept moving. I felt my breathing speed up. My chest got tight. Galen was still talking, but I couldn't understand the words anymore. Everything was too much. I sat down right there on the floor in the corner between 2 clothing racks, pulled my knees up and tried to breathe but couldn't get enough air. Galen crouched next to me asking if I was okay, but I couldn't answer. He pulled out his phone and called his mom. I don't know how long it took, but eventually Temperance was there. She got down on the floor with me and started talking in this calm voice, breathing exercises, counting, grounding techniques. Slowly my chest loosened, my breathing slowed. She helped me stand, and we left the store. In the car, she explained my nervous system needed time to adjust. Years of sensory deprivation meant normal stimulation felt like overload. My brain wasn't used to processing this much input. It would get easier, but I needed to go slow, build tolerance gradually, not push too hard too fast. Magnus Westbrook became my therapist starting the 2nd week. Temperance set up the appointment and drove me there. His office was quiet with soft lighting and comfortable chairs. He specialized in helping people who'd left cults and high-control groups. Our first session, he mostly asked questions about my isolation, my education, what I knew about the world, how I felt about everything that happened. I tried to answer honestly, told him about the soundproofing and blackout curtains, the 1920s textbooks, not being allowed friends or technology, learning Latin, but not knowing basic geography. He took notes and nodded and didn't act shocked by any of it. He explained that my social skills and emotional development were deliberately stunted by Mom's isolation, that I was essentially learning to be a teenager while also processing trauma. He said progress would be slow and non-linear. Some days I'd feel okay and other days everything would be hard. That was normal, expected. part of recovery from this kind of childhood. He said we'd work on building skills gradually, coping strategies for anxiety, social interaction practice, processing the trauma, understanding what happened and why. But it would take time, possibly years. And that was okay, because healing doesn't follow a schedule. Rose came over a few days later, and we sat in the Bowmans' backyard while she told me about her own recovery. She said it took 2 years of intensive therapy before she could function in normal society. 2 years of learning basic things everyone else knew: how to use technology, how to interact with people, how to handle crowds and noise and normal life. She still had nightmares about Montana, still struggled with trusting people because Pure Minds taught her everyone was dangerous, still had days where everything felt overwhelming and she wanted to hide. She said it scared her sometimes, that after all this time she still dealt with effects, but it also meant she understood what I was going through. She knew how hard everything was, how exhausting it felt to learn things that should be simple, how isolating it was to be so different from everyone else. Hearing her talk about still struggling years later was scary. It meant this wasn't something I'd just get over quickly, but it was also validating, because if Rose still found things hard sometimes, then I wasn't weak for finding everything so difficult now. This was just what recovery looked like: long and complicated and non-linear. The prosecutor came to meet me in week 3. His name was Sylvester Herman, and he was handling Mom's case. He sat with me and Temperance at the Bowman house and explained what charges Mom faced: child abuse, false imprisonment, conspiracy to commit kidnapping. He showed me documents about the case, Mom's notes about isolation protocols, the monitoring equipment she installed, the plans for my Montana transport. He said Pure Minds itself faced federal charges: running an illegal detention facility, systematic child abuse. They were building cases against the leadership. He asked if I'd be willing to testify if needed, to describe what Mom did, how the isolation affected me, what happened the night the FBI came. I said I would if it helped. He said my testimony might not be necessary because the evidence was strong, but he wanted me prepared just in case. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for next month. I'd need to attend even if I didn't testify. He'd prepare me for what to expect, how court worked, what Mom's lawyer might argue. He seemed confident about the case, said the documentation was clear, the evidence was overwhelming. Agent Seth came back with more information about Pure Minds. The investigation revealed facilities in 3 states: Montana, Idaho, Arizona. Over 40 children currently held in isolation conditions. Some had been there for years. The FBI was coordinating raids on all locations at once. They couldn't risk leadership destroying evidence or moving kids if they hit one facility first. Rose's documentation of the Montana layout was crucial for planning. She'd drawn maps, described security measures, listed staff members, all from her time working in the administrative office. Agent Seth said the raids would happen soon, within days. They wanted to move fast now that they had enough evidence. He asked Rose to brief the tactical teams about what to expect, where kids would be, how to extract them safely, what kind of psychological state they'd be in. Rose agreed. She looked nervous, but determined. Said she wanted to help get those kids out like someone should have gotten her out years ago. Galen tried being friendly by showing me his phone a few days later. He pulled up social media apps and tried explaining how they worked. People posted pictures of their food, their pets, their friends, random thoughts, everything. I didn't understand why anyone would share so much about their lives publicly, why they'd want strangers knowing what they ate for lunch. Galen showed me videos people made, jokes, dances, trends I'd never heard of. He referenced movies and shows and games constantly, things everyone apparently knew about. I recognized nothing. He was patient about it, didn't make me feel stupid for not knowing, treated me like a foreign exchange student from somewhere very isolated. His normalcy was comforting. He didn't treat me like I was broken or weird, just different, someone who needed help catching up. But it also highlighted how abnormal my entire existence had been. Everyone my age knew this stuff, had grown up with technology and social media and modern culture. I'd been learning Latin while they were learning how to exist in the actual world. The raids happened at dawn on a Tuesday. Agent Seth called the Bowman house to let us know. By noon, 43 children were in protective custody across 3 states. Rose and I watched the news coverage together. Cameras showed agents carrying kids out of buildings. The kids looked confused and terrified. Some were crying. Some seemed blank. Parents were screaming outside about religious persecution, about their rights, about the government stealing their children. Agents ignored them and kept working, loading kids into vans, taking them to safe locations. Temperance explained many of these children would have even harder adjustments than me. Some had been isolated since early childhood, never attended regular school, never had friends, never experienced normal family life. Some didn't know how to read, couldn't do basic math, had been taught the world was ending soon, that everyone outside Pure Minds was evil, that isolation was love. She said social services across 3 states were scrambling to find appropriate placements, therapists who understood cult trauma, educational programs for kids with massive gaps. It would take years to help all of them recover. Rose cried watching the coverage, said she remembered feeling exactly how those kids looked, scared and confused and not understanding what was happening, wondering if the people taking them away were actually the bad ones, like Pure Minds always said. I watched those kids being taken away and wondered if they'd been told their families were evil, like Mom told me. If they'd been promised safety, that turned out to be prison. Agent Seth called again the next morning with news about the Montana facility leader. Dashiell Pratt had tried running to Canada, but Border Patrol caught him at a checkpoint near Seattle. His car was packed with cash, fake identification papers, and encrypted hard drives. The FBI searched his compound and found filing cabinets full of psychological manipulation protocols, detailed instructions on breaking children's resistance, methods for convincing kids their parents abandoned them, techniques for making isolation feel like love. The financial records showed parents paid between $30,000 and $50,000 per child. Some families mortgaged their houses, sold everything they owned, all to send their kids to a place that destroyed them. Pratt made millions running Pure Minds while living in a mansion and driving luxury cars. The scope was bigger than anyone thought. More facilities than they'd known about, more children affected, more money stolen. Agent Seth said the case kept expanding as they dug deeper into the organization's operations. A woman named Dr. Rossi arrived at the Bowman house 3 days later. She was an educational consultant who specialized in helping kids with big learning gaps. Temperance had arranged for her to assess where I stood academically and create a plan. Dr. Rossi spent the whole morning testing me on different subjects. My Latin translation skills impressed her. She said my understanding of classical languages was college level. But when she asked me basic science questions, I couldn't answer most of them. I didn't know what DNA was, couldn't explain how electricity worked, had never heard of evolution. My math skills stopped at basic algebra because Mom's 1920s textbooks didn't go further. Dr. Rossi asked about modern history, and I knew nothing past 1950. Couldn't name the current president or explain what happened in the last 70 years. She looked sad when she finished the assessment, told me I had amazing strengths, but massive gaps that would take years to fill. The goal was getting my GED, but first I needed to learn things most kids knew by middle school: basic science, modern history, higher math. She worried about how I'd handle learning with other people after being alone so long. Said collaborative work would be hard for me. Dad got a call from Mom's lawyer the following week. A woman named Arabella Snyder wanted to discuss a plea deal. She claimed Mom was manipulated by Pure Minds and was actually a victim herself, that the organization brainwashed her into believing isolation was protection. Dad refused to meet with her. He told Sylvester Herman he wouldn't support that story, provided the prosecutor with evidence showing Mom's enthusiastic participation in cult activities, her detailed notes about isolation protocols, her planning for my Montana transport, the monitoring equipment she installed, the soundproofing she paid for. All of it proved she was actively involved, not manipulated. Dad said their marriage was over. He filed divorce papers within 2 weeks, moved his stuff out of the house into a small apartment, told me he couldn't forgive what she'd done even if he understood how Pure Minds worked. The lawyer kept calling, but Dad blocked her number. Temperance took me to my first support group meeting for cult survivors. We drove to a community center where about 15 people sat in a circle of chairs. Everyone else was an adult. People in their 20s and 30s who'd left various cults as teenagers or young adults. They went around sharing their stories. A man talked about losing his entire family when he escaped at 19. A woman described struggling to finish high school because she'd never learned to read properly. Another man said he still couldn't hold a job 10 years later because authority figures triggered his trauma. Their stories scared me. They were previews of my own future: lost education, damaged relationships, ongoing struggles with normal life. I felt sick listening to them. When it was my turn, I could barely speak. Just said I was 15 and recently got out of an isolation situation. After the meeting, a woman named Marguerite approached me. She said she'd left a different isolation cult at 16, told me she knew how terrifying everyone's stories probably seemed, but she promised it does get better, just very slowly. She gave me her phone number and said I could call any time. Rose stayed over at the Bowman house one night, and we talked in the basement guest room. She broke down crying and told me she felt guilty for leaving me behind when she escaped. Said she thought getting evidence to destroy Pure Minds completely was the only way to save me for real. But she tortured herself, imagining what I was going through those 3 years. Wondered if Mom was hurting me, if I thought Rose abandoned me, if I hated her for not coming back sooner. I told her I was still angry about believing she was dead, still processing that she let me think that for so long. But I was also grateful she came back with the FBI instead of just running away forever. She could have disappeared and built a new life somewhere. Instead, she spent 2 years gathering evidence and planning my rescue. That meant something even if it hurt. We sat there crying together for a long time, neither of us knowing what else to say. The preliminary hearing happened on a cold Tuesday morning. I had to attend to hear Mom's plea. The courtroom was smaller than I expected from TV shows I'd never watched. Mom sat at a table with Arabella Snyder wearing an orange jumpsuit. She stared at me when I walked in, but I looked away. The judge asked how she pleaded to the charges of child abuse, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Arabella stood and said not guilty, started arguing that Mom was exercising her parental rights to homeschool and protect her child from harmful influences, that she genuinely believed she was keeping me safe. Sylvester Herman stood up and presented evidence. Photos of the soundproofing in my room, records of the monitoring equipment, Mom's detailed notes about Pure Minds protocols, her planning documents for my Montana transport, text messages with the evaluators. He showed Dad's testimony about being blackmailed, proof that Dad opposed sending me away, but Mom threatened him. The judge listened to everything and asked Mom's lawyer several questions. Arabella kept insisting Mom was misguided, but not criminal. The judge disagreed, ordered Mom held without bail because she was a flight risk due to her Pure Minds connections. Mom started yelling that she was protecting me, that the judge didn't understand, that everyone was wrong. Guards had to remove her from the courtroom. Dad started seeing his own therapist to deal with his role in everything. He told me about it during one of his weekly visits to the Bowman house. Said he needed to address his passivity and fear, how he let Mom's blackmail control him for years, how he should have protected me better. Our conversations were awkward at first. He'd try to explain, and I'd just nod, but they got easier over time. He stopped making excuses and started taking real responsibility, admitting he was wrong, that he failed me, that fear didn't justify letting Mom hurt me. Temperance helped me understand I could be angry at him while also recognizing Mom manipulated him too, that both things could be true. Dad was a victim of her control, but also an adult who should have done more. I didn't have to forgive him right away, maybe not ever, but I could decide what kind of relationship we'd have going forward. I tried going to the library 2 weeks later. It seemed safer than a store because it was quiet and focused on books. Galen drove me there and walked in with me, but the computers everywhere confused me. The modern book covers looked nothing like the old books I knew. People were casually using technology like it was normal, which it was for them. A librarian noticed me staring at the catalog system looking lost. She came over and kindly showed me how to search for books, explained the different sections, how to use the computer to find what I wanted. She treated my ignorance like it was normal instead of weird. Didn't ask why I didn't know basic things, just helped me figure it out. I found some books about recent history and checked them out. Galen said I did good for my first library trip, but I felt exhausted from all the new information and stimulation. Galen invited me to hang out with his friends the next weekend. 3 guys came over to the Bowman house and we sat in the living room. They were nice enough, but the conversation was painful. They referenced movies I'd never seen, games I'd never played, events I knew nothing about. One guy asked what my favorite show was and I had no answer, just said I hadn't watched TV in years. They looked at each other confused, tried asking about music but I didn't know any current artists. They talked about school and teachers and I couldn't relate to any of it. After an hour, I made an excuse to leave. Went down to the basement feeling like an alien trying to pass as human. Galen came down later and apologized. Said his friends didn't mean to make me uncomfortable. I told him it wasn't their fault. They were normal, and I wasn't. He disagreed, but I knew it was true. Rose visited again a few days later. We were sitting in the Bowman's kitchen when she told me something she'd never shared before. 6 months after escaping Pure Minds, she tried to kill herself. Said she felt completely broken and unable to ever be normal. Couldn't see a future where she'd be okay. She was telling me this not to scare me, but to show that the darkest moments don't mean recovery is impossible. She survived, got help, did years of therapy. Now she was in a healthy relationship with someone named Rick, who she met through the FBI. Had a job she loved working on cult cases. Most days she felt genuinely okay despite the trauma. Some days were still hard, but they didn't destroy her anymore. She wanted me to know that feeling hopeless right now didn't mean I'd feel that way forever. That recovery was possible, even when it seemed impossible. Rose's words stayed with me over the next few days. The idea that someone could feel completely broken and still recover gave me something to hold on to during my worst moments. Seth called with news about the investigation. The FBI financial team found bank records showing Dashiell Pratt opened dozens of accounts under different names. Each account held money from parents paying for their kids to go to Montana. The amounts were huge. Some families paid $30,000, others paid $50,000. A few desperate parents paid over $70,000 for what they called intensive purification. The records showed Pratt personally controlled every account. Pure Minds claimed to be a non-profit religious organization on all their paperwork. They filed taxes showing minimal income and claimed everything went to educational programs. But the real money went straight to Pratt and the other leaders. They bought expensive cars and houses while telling parents the fees covered basic food and shelter for the kids. Seth said the evidence changed everything. What started as child abuse charges now included fraud and racketeering. The financial crimes carried serious prison time. Other parents who sent their kids to Montana were being contacted as victims of the fraud. Many had no idea their money went to personal bank accounts instead of helping their children. The case was growing bigger every day. Magnus started teaching me techniques for handling my anxiety during our sessions. He explained something called cognitive behavioral therapy. The basic idea was noticing my anxious thoughts and testing whether they were actually true. When I felt scared about going outside, I was supposed to ask myself what evidence I had that something bad would happen. Usually, I didn't have real evidence, just fear left over from Mom's warnings about the contaminated world. Magnus said we'd work on gradual exposure to normal activities. Start small with things that only made me a little nervous. Build up my tolerance slowly, instead of forcing me into situations that made me shut down completely. Our first exercise was walking around the Bowman's neighborhood for 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes outside on the sidewalk. It seemed easy, but my heart raced the whole time. Magnus walked beside me and had me describe everything I saw. The trees, the mailboxes, the parked cars. Focusing on concrete details helped keep the panic from taking over. We practiced grounding techniques, naming 5 things I could see, 4 things I could hear, 3 things I could touch, 2 things I could smell, 1 thing I could taste. The exercise pulled my brain away from the anxiety spiral and back to the present moment. After the walk, I felt exhausted but proud. 5 minutes didn't sound like much, but it was 5 minutes more than I'd managed before without having a panic attack. I spent time on Rose's laptop looking at websites for people who grew up in religious cults and extreme isolation. Finding these online communities felt like discovering I wasn't alone in the universe. Person after person described the exact same struggles I was having, not knowing how to make small talk, feeling years behind everyone their age, struggling with basic life skills that normal people learned as kids. One guy wrote about being 23 and still not understanding how to make friends. A woman described going to college at 25 after finally getting her GED. She talked about sitting in class feeling completely lost, while other students casually referenced movies and books and events she'd never heard of. Another person wrote about the shame of being an adult who didn't know how to drive or use a bank account or cook basic meals. Some people were doing really well years after leaving their isolated situations. They had jobs and relationships and lives that worked, but they were honest about how long recovery took. 5 years, 10 years. Some said they still had hard days even after decades of freedom. Others were still struggling with depression and anxiety and feeling broken. Reading their stories gave me a realistic picture of what recovery actually looked like. Not a straight line from bad to good, more like a messy path with progress and setbacks and slow improvement over time. The honesty helped more than people who tried to tell me everything would be fine. I needed to know recovery was possible, but also that it would be really hard. Dad's legal situation got resolved about a month after the FBI intervention. His lawyer worked out a plea deal with the prosecutor handling his embezzlement case. Dad had to pay back every dollar he stole, the full amount plus interest. He also got 6 months in jail, but only on weekends, Friday night through Sunday afternoon for 6 months, plus 2 years of probation and community service. The prosecutor considered several things when agreeing to the deal. Dad cooperated completely with both investigations. He gave detailed testimony about Mom's blackmail and how she controlled him with threats about prison. He provided evidence for the Pure Minds case without asking for anything in return. The judge acknowledged that Dad was a victim of Mom's manipulation, even though he was also an adult who made bad choices. The embezzlement was serious, but the circumstances were complicated. Dad lost his job, obviously. The company fired him as soon as the charges became public, but he found new work at a smaller accounting firm about 6 weeks later. The owner knew about Dad's record, but was willing to give him a chance. The pay was less and the job was lower level than before. Dad would be rebuilding his career from scratch, but he seemed grateful just to have work and a path forward. Sylvester Herman called and asked if I'd be willing to testify at the trial against Pure Minds leadership. He explained that my case was especially powerful because Mom kept such detailed records. Her binders full of isolation protocols and notes about Phase 3 showed exactly how the organization operated. My testimony could help the jury understand what Pure Minds actually did to kids, how the isolation damaged us, what it felt like to live under their rules. The idea of speaking in court made me want to throw up. Standing in front of strangers and talking about the worst parts of my life sounded impossible. All those people staring at me, having to answer questions about things I could barely think about without panicking. Magnus helped me work through my fear during our next session. He explained that testifying could protect other kids from ending up in Montana. My story might help the jury understand why pure minds needed to be stopped permanently. We talked about what testimony would actually involve. Sylvester would ask me questions, and I'd answer them. The defense lawyers might ask questions too, but Magnus said I could take breaks if I got overwhelmed. I wouldn't be alone up there. I finally told Sylvester I'd do it if absolutely necessary, but I hoped the evidence was strong enough without needing my testimony. He said they had a solid case either way. My testimony was backup in case they needed it. Rose took me to get my first smartphone a few days later. Walking into the phone store felt like entering a foreign country. Bright lights and displays everywhere. People casually playing with devices I didn't understand. Rose talked to a worker and explained I needed something basic. The worker showed us different options, without asking why a 15-year-old didn't already have a phone. Rose picked one with a simple interface and paid for it. In the car, she spent an hour setting it up. She installed parental controls, but explained these weren't to restrict me. They were to help me adjust gradually to having internet access after years of complete deprivation. The controls limited my time online and blocked certain sites that might be overwhelming. Rose showed me how to search for information, how to look up basic things I'd missed. We spent the rest of the afternoon sitting in the Bowman's kitchen looking stuff up. Current events from the past 3 years. Technology developments I knew nothing about. Cultural changes that happened while I was isolated. Every search led to 10 more questions. Rose was patient with my confusion about things that seemed obvious to her. She'd explain something, and I'd ask follow-up questions that showed how little I understood about the normal world. Having access to unlimited information felt exciting and scary at the same time. I could look up anything, learn about anything, but I also felt overwhelmed by how much I didn't know. The nightmares started about 2 weeks later. I'd dreamed the Pure Minds evaluators came back to take me to Montana. In the dreams, I'd be back in my soundproofed room and Mom would be packing my things. Dad would be standing there unable to help. Rose and the FBI would be gone like they never existed. I'd wake up convinced I was still trapped at home. The Bowman's basement would feel unfamiliar and wrong. I'd have to turn on lights and touch the walls and remind myself where I actually was. Some nights I woke up multiple times having the same nightmare over and over. Temperance explained this was normal trauma response. My brain was processing everything that happened by replaying the worst moments. She taught me reality-checking techniques. When I woke up scared, I was supposed to look around and name 5 things that proved I was safe. The basement window, Galen's video game system in the corner, the modern furniture, my new phone, the door that wasn't soundproofed. Focusing on concrete proof helped pull me out of the nightmare confusion. The Bowman family was patient with my 3 in the morning panic attacks. Sometimes Galen heard me moving around and came down to sit with me until I calmed down. He didn't try to talk much, just sat there playing games on his phone while I worked through the reality-checking exercises. Having someone nearby helped even when we didn't talk. Marguerite from the support group reached out and asked if I wanted to meet for coffee. She'd been out of her isolation cult for 8 years and seemed to be doing well. We met at a quiet coffee shop near the Bowman's house. Marguerite was 24 and worked as an elementary school teacher. She talked about her own recovery process honestly. The first few years were really hard. She struggled with basic social skills and felt completely behind her peers. She got her GED at 19 and started community college at 20. Even now, she had hard days where the trauma felt overwhelming, but she'd built a life that worked for her despite the gaps and struggles. She had friends who understood her background, a job she loved working with kids, a small apartment she could afford, therapy appointments she kept regularly. Marguerite helped me understand that recovering from this kind of childhood wasn't about becoming normal, whatever normal meant. It was about building a life that worked despite the damage. Some things would always be harder for me than for people who grew up normally. I'd probably always struggle with crowds and new situations, always feel behind in some ways, but that didn't mean I couldn't have a good life, just a different path to get there. We agreed to meet weekly to talk about practical recovery challenges. She became a mentor figure who understood what I was going through in ways even Rose and Magnus couldn't. The trial date got set for Pure Minds leadership about 6 weeks after the FBI raids. Dashiell Pratt and 6 other organization leaders would face federal charges together. Sylvester Herman explained the prosecution would show systematic child abuse across multiple states, financial fraud exceeding $5 million, conspiracy to kidnap and falsely imprison children. The evidence included financial records, facility documents, and testimony from survivors. Rose would testify about her 18 months at the Montana facility. Several other survivors agreed to speak about their experiences. Former Pure Minds members who left the organization would testify about the internal operations. My testimony was being held as backup if the prosecution needed additional evidence. Sylvester said the case was solid, but having survivor testimony made it stronger. The trial would probably last 2 weeks, maybe longer depending on how much the defense fought. The whole thing felt huge and scary and important. This was the moment Pure Minds would finally face real consequences for what they did to so many kids. The educational consultant suggested I try observing a community college class to see what formal education felt like. She arranged for me to sit in on an introductory history course. Just observe, not participate or take tests. Just see what a classroom was like. I walked into the room and immediately felt overwhelmed. 40 students sat at desks with laptops open. The professor stood at the front talking casually about World War II like everyone already knew the basic facts. He referenced movies I'd never seen, made jokes about current events I didn't understand. Students typed notes on their computers without seeming confused at all. I tried to follow along but got lost within minutes. The professor assumed everyone knew things I'd never learned. He'd say something like, "As we all remember from high school," and I'd realize I had no idea what he was talking about. Students raised their hands and asked questions that showed they understood way more than me. After 30 minutes, I left quietly and sat outside feeling completely defeated. The educational consultant found me and said this was actually helpful information. Now we knew I needed at least a year of intensive catch-up work before I'd be ready for any formal classroom. Maybe longer. The gap between my education and normal education was even bigger than we thought, but knowing that meant we could plan better, build a program that actually prepared me instead of throwing me into situations I wasn't ready for. 2 weeks after I told the educational consultant I wasn't ready for any classroom, an envelope arrived at Dad's apartment with Mom's return address from the county jail. Dad brought it to me where I was sitting at the kitchen table working through a math workbook. The envelope sat between us while I stared at it like it might explode. Dad said Mom's lawyer had contacted him about arranging a meeting where she could explain herself and apologize for what happened. My hands started shaking just looking at her handwriting on the envelope. I called Temperance immediately, and she came over within an hour. She read the letter while I sat on the couch trying to breathe normally. Mom had written 3 pages about how much she loved me and wanted to help me understand her choices. She claimed everything she did was to protect me from a world that destroys children's innocence and potential. She said if I would just meet with her, she could explain how Pure Minds was actually right about modern society being toxic. Temperance set the letter down and looked at me with concern. She said meeting with Mom right now during my fragile recovery stage would be incredibly harmful. Magnus agreed when I called him next. He said Mom was still deeply committed to the cult ideology, and any contact would likely set back my progress. I told them I didn't want to see her anyway, because I wasn't ready to face her after everything. Dad visited Mom once at the jail to tell her I wouldn't be meeting with her. He came back looking exhausted and told me she spent the whole visit insisting Pure Minds was right and she was protecting me from contamination. She showed absolutely no understanding that she'd hurt me or done anything wrong. She kept saying I'd thank her someday when I was older and realized how corrupt the world really was. Dad said it was like talking to a stranger who looked like his wife but couldn't hear anything that contradicted her beliefs. 3 months after the FBI raids, the trial date finally arrived for Pure Minds leadership. Dashiell Pratt and 6 other organization leaders would face federal charges together in the downtown courthouse. Rose picked me up early that morning with Seth and Temperance. Galen came too for moral support, even though he didn't have to be there. The courthouse was this huge stone building with metal detectors at every entrance. Security guards checked everyone's bags and made us walk through scanners. The courtroom itself had dark wood everywhere and rows of benches like church pews. Rose and I sat in the second row right behind the prosecution table, where Sylvester Herman was organizing stacks of documents. The defense lawyers sat across the aisle with Dashiell Pratt and the other Pure Minds leaders. Pratt looked smaller in person than I'd imagined, just a regular middle-aged man in a suit. But seeing him made my stomach hurt because he was the one who ran the Montana facility where Rose spent 18 months. The judge entered and everyone stood up. She was a black woman, probably in her 50s, who looked stern but not mean. Sylvester Herman stood to give his opening statement. He explained how Pure Minds systematically abused over 50 children across multiple facilities in 3 different states. He described the isolation protocols that kept kids completely cut off from families and normal society. He showed photos of the Montana facility with its locked rooms and monitored spaces. He presented financial records proving the organization collected over $5 million from desperate parents while claiming religious nonprofit status. He explained how Dashiell Pratt and other leaders lived in luxury, while children at their facilities lacked adequate medical care, nutrition, and basic education. The defense lawyer stood up next and argued this was about religious freedom and parental rights. He claimed Pure Minds was simply helping families protect their children from corrupting modern influences. He said the government was persecuting people for their sincerely held religious beliefs about child development and education. He insisted the children weren't abused, but were being raised according to their parents' values, away from toxic cultural forces. I felt sick, listening to him twist everything into something noble, instead of the nightmare it actually was. The next day, Rose had to testify, and I could tell she was nervous, even though she tried to hide it. She wore a dark blue suit and had her hair pulled back. Sylvester Herman asked her to describe her 18 months at the Montana facility. Rose's voice stayed steady as she explained how she was sent there at age 14, after Mom decided she was showing signs of contamination. She described the first month of complete isolation in a small room with no windows or personal items. She talked about the daily sessions where Pure Minds counselors told her that her thoughts were diseased and her memories were false. She explained how they used sleep deprivation and constant monitoring to break down her sense of self. She described watching other kids have complete breakdowns from the psychological pressure. She talked about the conditioning designed to make children believe they were fundamentally broken and could only be fixed through Pure Minds protocols. Her voice cracked a little when she described the moment she realized she had to pretend to be purified, or she'd never get out. The defense lawyer stood up for cross-examination and immediately tried to discredit her by pointing out her FBI involvement. He suggested she was making up stories to help the prosecution's case. Rose looked right at him and calmly explained she joined the investigation specifically because of what Pure Minds did to her and dozens of other kids. She said she spent 2 years gathering evidence because she didn't want any other child to go through what she experienced. The defense lawyer tried to make her seem biased, but she stayed composed and factual. When she finished testifying and walked back to sit with me, I grabbed her hand and held it tight. I couldn't imagine having the courage to speak publicly about trauma like that. Throughout the rest of the week, other Pure Minds survivors took the stand one by one. A young man named Daniel talked about being sent to the Montana facility when he was 13. He described 6 years of isolation that left him completely unprepared for independent life when he was finally released at 19. He still struggled with basic social interactions and had never finished high school because his Pure Minds education was so limited. A woman named Rebecca testified about watching her younger sister Lauren have a complete mental breakdown under the isolation protocols. Lauren had been 10 years old when she was sent to Montana. After 3 years there, she stopped speaking entirely and had to be hospitalized for severe depression. Rebecca's voice shook with anger as she described how Pure Minds destroyed her sister's childhood and left permanent psychological damage. Another survivor talked about the medical neglect at the facilities. Kids with serious health problems didn't get proper treatment because Pure Minds leaders believed modern medicine was contaminating. One boy had untreated asthma that got so bad he nearly died before his parents finally pulled him out. Each testimony built on the previous ones, showing the same patterns of isolation, manipulation, psychological abuse, and neglect. By the end of the week, the cumulative effect was devastating. The jury looked increasingly disturbed as they heard story after story of children being systematically damaged by Pure Minds protocols. The following Monday, Edith Quigley took the stand as the prosecution's key insider witness. She'd been a devoted Pure Minds member for 7 years before she realized what the organization really was and agreed to work with the FBI. Sylvester Herman asked her to explain how Pure Minds recruited new families. Edith described how they deliberately targeted vulnerable parents who had troubled children or were anxious about modern society. They'd attend homeschool conventions and parenting seminars looking for families struggling with typical teenage behavior. They'd approach parents and offer solutions that sounded reasonable at first, but gradually escalated into complete isolation. She explained the recruitment process started with warnings about digital dangers and cultural corruption. Then came recommendations for limiting technology and outside influences. Then suggestions about specialized education away from contaminating peers. By the time parents realized they were in a cult, they'd already invested thousands of dollars and isolated their kids so much that backing out felt impossible. Edith described the escalating isolation protocols that Pure Minds called cognitive purification. First stage was limiting technology and modern media. Second stage was restricting peer contact and outside education. Third stage was complete isolation in controlled facilities like Montana. She explained how they convinced parents this was necessary child protection instead of systematic abuse. She testified about the financial exploitation where desperate parents paid up to $50,000 for Montana facility placement. She showed internal Pure Minds documents proving the leaders knew they were running a profitable business disguised as religious education. Her testimony connected all the pieces, showing Pure Minds wasn't a sincere religious organization, but a systematic criminal operation that deliberately harmed children for profit. The next phase of the trial focused on financial evidence. Sylvester Herman presented bank records showing Dashiell Pratt personally made over $3 million from Pure Minds operations. Records proved he owned 2 vacation homes, 3 luxury cars, and took frequent international trips, while claiming the organization was a struggling nonprofit. Other Pure Minds leaders showed similar patterns of lavish personal spending funded by parent fees. Meanwhile, the Montana facility where children lived had minimal food budgets, no proper medical supplies, and educational materials that were decades old. Financial documents showed Pure Minds spent more on Pratt's car payments than on feeding all the kids at Montana for a month. They paid for leaders' resort vacations, while children at facilities lacked winter coats and basic hygiene products. Tax records proved Pure Minds claimed religious nonprofit status to avoid taxes while operating as a profitable business. The fraud charges were supported by extensive documentation that Rose had helped the FBI obtain during her 2 years working undercover. She'd copied thousands of financial records, internal communications, and operational documents before disappearing from Pure Minds. Those documents now filled exhibit tables at the front of the courtroom, proving systematic fraud alongside the child abuse. After 2 weeks of testimony, Sylvester Herman called me at the Bowman house to say my testimony wouldn't be necessary. The case was already overwhelmingly strong with Rose's testimony, the other survivors, Edith's insider information, and the financial evidence. He said adding my testimony would just be redundant at this point, and he knew it would be difficult for me. I felt this huge wave of relief because I'd been dreading having to speak in court. I still attended the closing arguments, though, because I wanted to see how it ended. Sylvester Herman stood before the jury and systematically dismantled every defense argument. He showed how Pure Minds wasn't about sincere religious belief, but about profit and control. He demonstrated that parents' rights don't include the right to psychologically torture children through isolation. He proved the organization deliberately targeted vulnerable families and exploited their fears for financial gain. He showed photos of the facility's locked rooms alongside photos of Pratt's vacation homes. He quoted internal Pure Minds documents where leaders discussed how much money they could extract from desperate parents. His closing argument made it crystal clear that Pure Minds was a criminal enterprise that destroyed children's lives while enriching its leaders. The defense lawyer tried to argue religious persecution, but his words sounded hollow after 2 weeks of devastating testimony. The jury left to deliberate, and we all went home to wait. 3 days later, we got the call that the jury had reached a verdict. Everyone rushed back to the courthouse. The courtroom was packed with survivors and their families, all waiting to hear the decision. The jury foreman stood and read the verdict, guilty on all counts for Dashiell Pratt. Child abuse, fraud, racketeering, conspiracy. Guilty for all 6 other Pure Minds leaders on their respective charges. The courtroom erupted. People were crying and hugging each other. Rose grabbed my hand, and we both had tears running down our faces. The organization that had hurt so many people were finally being held accountable. Pratt's face went completely white as the judge read through all the guilty verdicts. The other leaders looked shocked, like they'd actually believed they'd get away with it. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 months later and ordered all defendants held without bail. As marshals led them away in handcuffs, I felt this weight lift that I didn't even know I'd been carrying. It was really over. Pure Minds was done. Mom's separate trial was scheduled for 3 weeks after the Pure Minds verdict. Her charges were individual counts of child abuse, false imprisonment, and attempted kidnapping related specifically to what she did to me. Her lawyer, Arabella Snyder, tried to argue Mom was brainwashed by Pure Minds and shouldn't be held fully responsible for her actions. She presented Mom as another victim of the cult's manipulation who genuinely believed she was protecting her child. But Sylvester Herman countered with Mom's detailed notes, showing enthusiastic participation in Pure Minds activities. He presented evidence that Mom had independently installed monitoring equipment and soundproofing in our house before Pure Minds even suggested it. He showed her planning documents for my Montana transport that she'd created on her own initiative. He demonstrated that Mom wasn't just following Pure Minds instructions, but was actively developing her own isolation protocols. The evidence of her monitoring cameras, the soundproofed room, the blackout curtains, and the scheduled Montana transport made her active role completely undeniable. She wasn't a passive victim following orders, but an enthusiastic participant who took Pure Minds' ideology and ran with it. The prosecutor told me I'd have to testify at Mom's trial because I was the victim of her specific charges. Magnus and Temperance spent hours preparing me for the experience. We practiced answering questions and dealing with cross-examination. We worked on staying calm and focused even when talking about difficult things. The morning of my testimony, Rose sat in the front row where I could see her. Magnus was there too, along with Seth and Temperance. I walked to the witness stand feeling like I might throw up. Sylvester Herman asked me to describe the 3 years of isolation. I explained how it started with technology restrictions when I was 12, how the rules escalated every few weeks until I wasn't allowed to leave our property, how Mom installed soundproofing and blackout curtains so I couldn't hear or see the outside world, how she homeschooled me with 1920s textbooks and refused to teach me anything about current events, how she monitored everything I did and said. I described the night the Pure Minds evaluators came and said I needed immediate transport to Montana, the terror I felt, knowing I was about to be sent to the facility where I thought Rose had died, how Mom was packing my things and planning to send me that same night. My voice stayed mostly steady, but I had to pause a few times to breathe. Mom stared at me the whole time from the defense table. Her expression wasn't angry or sad. It was this weird blank look like she was watching a stranger instead of her son, like nothing I said was reaching her at all. Arabella stood and called Mom to the witness stand. Mom walked up there with her back straight and her chin up like she was proud of everything she'd done. Arabella asked her to explain her actions over the 3 years of my isolation. Mom talked for almost an hour about protecting me from a world that destroys children's minds. She said modern society was poison, and Pure Minds taught her how to keep me safe from contamination. She described the soundproofing and blackout curtains like they were gifts instead of prison walls. She explained the 1920s textbooks as superior education compared to modern propaganda. Every word she spoke made it clear she still believed Pure Minds was right about everything. Arabella asked if she regretted anything, and Mom said her only regret was not starting the isolation protocols earlier. She said if she'd protected me from birth, I wouldn't have shown signs of contamination that required Montana intervention. The jury looked horrified. Several of them were shaking their heads. Mom didn't seem to notice or care about their reactions. Sylvester stood for cross-examination and asked Mom if she understood that her actions had harmed me. Mom said no. She'd protected me, and someday I'd thank her for it. He asked if she knew isolation damages child development, and she said that was propaganda from people who wanted children exposed to corruption. He showed her my therapy records describing anxiety, social difficulties, and educational gaps. Mom said those problems came from my contamination, not from her protection. She insisted Pure Minds' methodology was sound, and the real abuse was letting children access modern society. Sylvester asked if she planned to continue isolation protocols if released, and Mom said absolutely, it was her duty as a parent. The prosecution rested, and Arabella tried damage control, but there was no fixing what Mom had just said. She'd basically confessed to everything and promised to do it again. The jury left to deliberate around noon. We went to a waiting room down the hall. Rose sat next to me, holding my hand. Dad paced back and forth, looking sick. Magnus reminded me to breathe. 6 hours felt like 6 years. Finally, the bailiff came and said the jury had reached a verdict. We filed back into the courtroom. Mom sat at the defense table, staring straight ahead with that same blank expression. The jury foreman stood when the judge asked for the verdict. Guilty on count 1, child abuse. Guilty on count 2, false imprisonment. Guilty on count 3, attempted kidnapping. Mom didn't react at all. Arabella put her head in her hands. Rose started crying and squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. Dad sat down heavily in his seat behind me. The judge thanked the jury and scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. As marshals led Mom out, she looked at me one time. Her face still showed no understanding that she'd done anything wrong. The sentencing hearing happened on a cold morning in November. Sylvester called Dad to testify about the years of manipulation and blackmail. Dad described how Mom threatened to turn him in for embezzlement if he interfered with her Pure Minds activities. He explained watching her isolate me more and more while feeling trapped by his own mistakes. He asked the judge for significant prison time to protect me and give me space to recover without her interference. His voice broke several times while he talked. I'd written a victim impact statement that the prosecutor read to the court. It described the 3 years of isolation and how it damaged my education. I explained that I didn't know basic things about the modern world that other kids my age learned naturally. I talked about the social anxiety and panic attacks that made normal activities overwhelming. I described the terror I felt when the evaluators said I needed Montana transport. I asked the court to make sure I could recover safely without Mom trying to contact me or continue her isolation protocols. The judge read through all the evidence again. She talked about how Mom's actions went far beyond normal parenting decisions into systematic abuse. She noted Mom's complete lack of remorse and her stated intention to continue the same behavior if released. Mom was sentenced to 12 years in prison with possibility of parole after 8. The judge issued a permanent restraining order prohibiting any contact with me unless I initiated it as an adult. Mom was also ordered to pay restitution for my therapy and educational costs. As the marshals moved to take her away, Mom suddenly stood and shouted across the courtroom. She said I'd understand someday that she was protecting me. She said Pure Minds was right about everything and modern society would destroy me. She said she loved me too much to let the world contaminate my mind. The marshals had to physically restrain her and lead her out while she kept shouting about protection and purity. Her voice echoed down the hallway even after the courtroom doors closed. Rose was crying again. Dad looked like he might be sick. I just felt numb and exhausted. 3 weeks later, Rose and I sat in another courtroom for Dashiell Pratt's sentencing. The federal judge had already found him guilty on all counts. Today was about how long he'd spend in prison. Sylvester presented evidence of the 43 children rescued from Pure Minds facilities. He showed documentation of the psychological damage Pratt's protocols caused. He presented financial records proving Pratt made over $3 million from the Montana facility alone. The judge called Pratt's operation a systematic criminal enterprise that destroyed children's lives for profit. Dashiell Pratt received 25 years in federal prison. The other Pure Minds leaders got sentences ranging from 8 to 18 years, depending on their level of involvement. The judge ordered all Pure Minds assets seized to provide restitution to victims. Every facility was permanently closed, and the organization was officially dissolved. Rose and I held hands while the sentences were read. When it was finally over, we walked out of the courthouse together into cold November air. We drove to the community center where the support group met. About 15 survivors were there, including Marguerite. Rose stood up and told everyone that Pure Minds was done. The facilities were closed. The leaders were in prison. Several people started crying. Others hugged each other. One woman who'd lost her daughter to the Montana facility for 2 years just kept saying, "Thank you," over and over. We stayed for hours talking and sharing the news with people who couldn't attend the sentencing. For the first time since this whole thing started, I felt like maybe we'd actually stopped them from hurting anyone else. 6 months passed after the FBI intervention. I was still living with the Bowman family in their basement room. Temperance said I was making steady progress toward independence. My educational work was going well. I'd caught up on basic science concepts I'd missed during Mom's isolation. Modern history made sense now, and I understood current events. My math skills were improving, though I still struggled with some concepts. Magnus said my social anxiety was decreasing gradually. I could handle short trips to stores now without panic attacks. Restaurants were okay if they weren't too crowded. I'd gone to a movie theater with Galen and managed to sit through the whole film despite the noise and people. Crowds still overwhelmed me quickly, but I was learning to recognize my limits and remove myself before complete shutdowns happened. I had a routine that worked. Mornings I did educational work with my tutor. Afternoons I had therapy or support group. Evenings I spent with the Bowman family doing normal things like eating dinner and watching TV. Galen had become a real friend. He was patient with my weird gaps in knowledge and didn't make fun of me for not understanding references everyone else got. Some days were still really hard. I'd wake up from nightmares about the Pure Minds evaluators. I'd have moments where normal sounds or lights triggered panic responses, but those moments were getting less frequent. I was learning to live in the world instead of hiding from it. Dad had been apartment hunting for a few weeks when he finally found a place he liked. It was a small 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet complex near a park. He asked if I'd be willing to live with him once I was ready to leave the Bowmans. The question made my stomach twist with complicated feelings. I was still angry about his years of passivity, while Mom isolated me. He'd let her install soundproofing and monitoring equipment. He'd watched her cut me off from the world and done nothing until the very end. But I also saw how hard he was working to make amends. He attended his own therapy twice a week. He visited me regularly and never made excuses for his failures. He'd testified against Mom and supported my recovery completely. Temperance helped me think through the decision during our sessions. She explained I could try living with Dad while maintaining clear boundaries. If the arrangement didn't work, I could always change it. Living with him didn't mean forgiving everything or pretending the past didn't happen. It meant giving him a chance to prove he'd actually changed through consistent actions. I told Dad I'd try it, but we needed rules. I needed my own space that he wouldn't invade. I needed him to respect when I said I needed quiet or alone time. I needed honest conversations about what happened instead of him avoiding difficult topics. He agreed to everything immediately. Moving day was weird and emotional. The Bowmans had become like family over the past 6 months. Temperance hugged me and said I could call any time. Seth reminded me their door was always open if I needed anything. Galen helped carry my stuff to Dad's car and made me promise to hang out regularly. The apartment was small but clean. Dad had set up my room with blackout curtains because he knew I still needed darkness to sleep. He'd gotten a white noise machine for the nighttime sounds that bothered me. He'd stocked the kitchen with foods I liked. We established a routine quickly. Mornings were quiet time when we both did our own things. Dad worked from home doing accounting. I did educational work. Lunch, we'd eat together and talk about safe topics like books or current events. Afternoons, I had therapy or support group. Evenings, we'd make dinner together. Dad was attending his own therapy and working through his guilt about enabling Mom. He didn't try to make excuses or minimize what he'd allowed to happen. He took responsibility and worked on changing. Our relationship was cautious but improving. We had honest conversations about what happened and what we both needed going forward. Some days I was still angry at him. Some days I appreciated his efforts. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like genuine progress toward something better. Rose called one evening in early spring, sounding excited and nervous. She told me to sit down because she had big news. She was engaged to Rick, her partner who worked for the FBI. They'd met during the Pure Minds investigation when Rick was assigned to her protective detail. He understood her trauma history because he'd seen her work through the case. He knew about her nightmares and hard days. He'd supported her recovery without trying to fix her or make her feel broken. Rose asked if I'd be in the wedding party. The request made me feel honored and terrified at the same time. Being in a wedding meant being around lots of people in a formal setting. It meant standing in front of a crowd while everyone watched. It meant noise and activity and social interaction that could easily overwhelm me. But Rose was my sister, who'd risked everything to save me from Montana. She'd worked with the FBI for 2 years to take down Pure Minds. She'd testified in court and relived her trauma to protect other kids. If she wanted me in her wedding, I wasn't going to let anxiety stop me. I told her yes, and she started crying happy tears over the phone. Magnus helped me prepare for the sensory and social challenges the wedding would present. We worked on coping strategies for managing crowds. We practiced staying present when things got overwhelming. We planned exit strategies if I needed to remove myself from the situation. Rose was understanding about my needs. She said I could step away any time and she wouldn't be upset. Just knowing I'd try meant everything to her. The educational consultant Temperance had connected me called with information about a specialized program. It was designed for young adults with significant educational gaps due to abuse or isolation. The program combined individualized instruction with life skills training and therapy support. I'd worked toward my GED while also learning practical things I'd missed during my isolation years. They taught job skills like interviewing and workplace behavior. They covered financial literacy like budgeting and banking. They included social navigation skills for situations I found confusing. The consultant explained the program specifically served people recovering from situations like mine. They understood trauma-informed education. They were patient with varying skill levels. They didn't expect students to already know things that normal schooling would have taught. The program met 5 days a week at a community center downtown. Classes were small, usually 8 to 10 students. Teachers worked individually with each person based on their specific needs and goals. There was a therapist on site for students who needed support. The program was free, funded by grants for abuse survivors. I could start anytime I felt ready. My first day at the educational program was terrifying. Dad drove me to the community center and walked me inside. The classroom was small and quiet with big windows and comfortable chairs. 8 other students were already there, all around my age or a bit older. The teacher introduced herself and asked me to share a little about my background if I felt comfortable. I explained I'd been homeschooled in isolation and had significant gaps in modern education. 2 other students nodded like they understood completely. Over the first week, I learned everyone's stories. One girl named Sarah had grown up in a religious cult that didn't allow formal education past age 12. A guy named James had been kept isolated by abusive parents who claimed he was too sick to attend school. Another girl named Talia had spent years in hospitals with medical isolation that interrupted her education. Having peers who understood the specific challenges of catching up on missed childhood made everything feel less scary. Nobody made fun of me for not knowing things other teenagers learned years ago. Nobody acted like my questions were stupid or obvious. The teachers were patient when I struggled with concepts. They celebrated small victories like me finally understanding a math problem I'd been working on for days. They didn't rush me or compare me to other students. They met me where I was and helped me move forward from there. A few months into the program, Marguerite mentioned she had someone I should meet. Her friend ran an organization that helped people recover from isolation and high-control groups. She said they offered support groups and educational resources specifically for survivors. Marguerite drove me to their office in a converted house downtown. Inside, a woman named Caroline welcomed us and explained how the organization worked. They had weekly support groups for different age ranges. They provided advocacy services for people dealing with legal issues related to their abuse. They connected survivors with therapists who understood cult dynamics. Caroline asked if I'd be interested in volunteering with their youth outreach program once I felt ready. They needed people who'd been through isolation to talk with kids currently trapped in similar situations. She said hearing from someone who survived and was building a life afterward gave isolated kids hope that escape was possible. I told her I'd think about it because public speaking terrified me, but the idea of helping other kids felt meaningful. 3 weeks later, I started volunteering 2 afternoons a week. My job was answering messages from kids who found the organization's website. Some were in situations like mine with parents in cults. Others faced different types of isolation from abusive families or medical conditions. I shared my story carefully, focusing on the recovery process and how things gradually got better. Several kids told me it helped knowing someone understood what they were going through. One 15-year-old girl said my messages were the only thing keeping her going until she could get help. That feeling of actually helping someone made the volunteer work feel important, despite how hard it was emotionally. Galen and I stayed friends after I moved in with Dad. He texted me regularly about random stuff like music or funny things that happened at the school. He invited me to hang out with his friends at the park or the mall. The first few times were awkward, because his friends still didn't know how to talk to me. They'd reference shows I'd never seen or games I'd never played, but gradually they stopped treating me like I was strange. They started explaining references without making it weird. They included me in conversations even when I couldn't contribute much. One of Galen's friends named Tyler started teaching me about video games at his house. Another friend named Jordan showed me how social media worked and helped me set up accounts. Slowly, I was building a small group of people who accepted that I was learning basic things most people knew by 12. They didn't make me feel stupid for asking what seemed like obvious questions. When I didn't understand a joke, they'd explain it casually. When I got overwhelmed at loud places, they'd suggest somewhere quieter without making a big deal about it. Having actual friends my age felt impossible a year ago. Now I had people who texted me just to chat or invited me places because they wanted me there. It wasn't a huge social circle, but it was real friendships with people who knew my history and didn't judge me for it. Dad and I had been living together for several months when he asked if we could talk seriously. We sat at the kitchen table and he started by saying he needed to fully acknowledge what he'd let happen. He said his fear of going to prison for the embezzlement made him passive, while Mom isolated me for years. He said he told himself he was protecting me by staying and keeping some stability, but really, he was protecting himself. He said there was no excuse for letting Mom install soundproofing and blackout curtains in my room. No excuse for not fighting harder when she canceled all my outside contact. No excuse for almost letting her send me to Montana. He wasn't crying or being dramatic. He was just stating facts about his failure as a parent. Then he said he was committed to supporting my recovery however long it took. He said he'd keep going to therapy to understand his own issues. He said he'd respect whatever boundaries I needed and wouldn't push for forgiveness I wasn't ready to give. I told him I was still angry about the years he let pass without protecting me. I told him I appreciated his honesty now and his current efforts to make things right. I told him rebuilding trust was going to take a long time, and some days I'd be more angry than others. He said he understood, and he'd keep showing up and trying to be the father he should have been all along. The conversation didn't fix everything, but it felt like real progress. He wasn't making excuses or trying to minimize what happened. He was taking actual responsibility and committing to long-term change. That mattered, even though I was still working through complicated feelings about him. Rose's wedding happened on a sunny Saturday in June. The ceremony was outside in a garden with about 50 guests. I stood up with the wedding party wearing a suit Rose helped me pick out. My heart was racing the entire time, but I used all the grounding techniques Magnus taught me. I focused on my breathing. I counted things I could see around me. I reminded myself I could step away if needed. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Rose looked happy in a way I'd never seen before. Rick kept looking at her like she was the most important person in the world. When they said their vows, I had to blink back tears. After the ceremony came the reception in a building next to the garden. There was music and food and lots of people talking. The noise and activity were overwhelming but manageable because I'd prepared for it. Dancing at the reception was my first experience with that kind of social situation. I was incredibly awkward and had no idea what I was doing, but people were kind about it. Galen showed me some basic moves. Tyler and Jordan goofed around with me so I felt less self-conscious. Rose came over during a slow song and hugged me. She said she was proud of how far I'd come in less than a year. She said watching me at her wedding, talking with friends and managing the overwhelming environment showed how much progress I'd made. I realized I was proud too, even though I knew I had years of recovery still ahead. A year ago, I couldn't leave the Bowman's basement without panicking. Now, I was at a wedding reception dancing badly, but genuinely enjoying myself. That felt like a huge achievement. The GED practice tests happened on a Tuesday morning at the educational program. I sat in a quiet room with the reading and writing sections first. The reading comprehension was easier than I expected, because my classical education had given me strong analytical skills. I could break down complex passages and identify main ideas quickly. The writing section asked me to compose an essay about a social issue. I wrote about isolation abuse and warning signs families should watch for. My teacher said it was one of the strongest essays she'd seen from the program. Math and science would take much longer. I was still learning basic algebra and struggling with concepts most people learned in middle school. Science was better because I'd been catching up on biology and chemistry, but physics made no sense yet. The program director called me into her office after reviewing my practice test scores. She said my reading and writing scores were high enough that I could probably pass those sections of the real GED now. She said if I kept working on math and science at my current pace, I might be ready for the full test within 18 months. That timeline felt both exciting and daunting. 18 months seemed like forever, but also not enough time. Still, having a concrete goal of getting my GED and then maybe attending community college gave me something to work toward. It was a milestone that would mean I'd built real educational foundations, despite the years Mom stole from me. Caroline from the Survivor Support Organization called one afternoon with a request. She asked if I'd be willing to write an article for their newsletter about isolation abuse warning signs. She said my case was particularly clear in showing how restrictions escalated gradually. She thought reading about that progression might help other families recognize similar patterns before things got as bad as they did for me. I spent a week writing the article with Magnus's help. I described how Mom started with seemingly reasonable concerns about internet safety, how she moved to banning all technology, then modern books, then outside friends, how each restriction was presented as protection but actually increased my isolation. I explained how pure minds exploited parental fears about modern society to justify extreme control. I included specific warning signs like monitoring equipment, soundproofing, and talk of sending kids to isolated facilities. The article ran in the organization's monthly newsletter that went out to hundreds of families. Over the next few weeks, Caroline told me several parents had contacted them, saying the article helped them recognize concerning patterns in their own situations. One mother said she'd been considering a group similar to Pure Minds, but my article made her realize the warning signs were there. Another father said reading about the gradual escalation helped him understand what was happening with his ex-wife's increasingly restrictive homeschooling. Knowing my story helped even a few families avoid what I went through, made the difficulty of writing about my trauma feel worthwhile. Magnus told me during a regular session that I'd made remarkable progress over the past year. He said my anxiety symptoms had decreased significantly. He said I'd developed healthy coping strategies for managing overwhelming situations. He said my ability to form and maintain relationships had improved dramatically from when we started. He pulled out his notes from our first session and read some of what he'd written. Back then, I couldn't make eye contact. I shut down completely when discussing my isolation. I had panic attacks multiple times per session. Now I could talk about my experiences without dissociating. I could identify my triggers and use grounding techniques. I could push through difficult situations instead of always avoiding them. Magnus said I'd probably always have hard days because trauma doesn't completely disappear. But I was building a life that worked despite what I'd been through. Then he said he wanted to reduce our sessions from weekly to every other week. He said it was a sign of progress, not abandonment. He said I'd developed enough skills that I didn't need such intensive support anymore. Part of me felt proud because it meant I was doing better. Part of me felt scared because I'd relied so heavily on our weekly sessions. Magnus said the fear was normal, and we could always increase frequency again if needed. He said learning to manage with less support was part of building independence. I agreed to try the bi-weekly schedule while acknowledging it felt both like an achievement and slightly terrifying. A year after the FBI intervention, my life looked completely different. I was enrolled full-time in the educational program, attending classes 5 days a week. I volunteered at the Survivor Support Organization twice a week, helping other isolated kids through their recovery. I lived successfully with Dad in our small apartment, and our relationship continued improving through honest communication and his consistent efforts. I maintained meaningful relationships with Rose, who visited weekly for dinner. I stayed close with the Bowmans, having Sunday lunch at their house most weeks. Marguerite and I met for coffee regularly to talk about recovery challenges. I had my small group of friends through Galen, who included me in their activities. I was studying for my GED with plans to eventually attend community college. Dad was teaching me to drive in empty parking lots on weekends, and I was getting better at handling the car. I had a part-time job shelving books at the library 3 afternoons a week. The same librarian who'd helped me that first time I snuck in to research Pure Minds had recommended me for the position. My days were full of normal activities that would seem boring to most people, but felt miraculous to me. Going to class, working at the library, hanging out with friends, having dinner with Dad, These simple routines represented the normal life I'd been denied for 3 years. I still had hard days when anxiety spiked, or I felt overwhelmed by how much I'd missed. But I also had good days that outnumbered the bad ones. I was building something real despite the trauma, and that felt like genuine progress. Rose called one evening and asked if she could come over to talk. She arrived looking nervous and excited at the same time. She sat down on our couch and told me she was pregnant. Then she asked if I wanted to be involved as an uncle. The question made me start crying because it meant she trusted me despite everything we'd both been through. It meant she believed I was stable enough to be part of her child's life. It meant she saw me as someone who could contribute something positive instead of just someone damaged by trauma. I told her I was honored and excited. I told her the idea of helping raise a kid who had a normal childhood felt like a chance to witness what I'd missed. I told her I wanted to be the best uncle I could be. Then I admitted I was also nervous because I had zero experience with normal child development. I didn't know what babies needed or how to interact with kids. Rose laughed and said, "Nobody really knows what they're doing with their first child." She said we'd figure it out together. She said having me involved would actually help because I'd appreciate things other people took for granted. She said watching her child grow up with freedom and normal experiences would be healing for both of us in different ways. We spent the rest of the evening talking about her pregnancy and making plans. She was due in 7 months. She and Rick were setting up a nursery. She wanted me to come to doctor appointments if I felt comfortable. The whole conversation felt surreal because a year ago, I thought Rose was dead. Now she was having a baby and wanted me to be part of that child's life. It was another reminder of how dramatically things had changed and how much possibility existed in my future. The Survivor Support Organization hosted a reunion event for people affected by Pure Minds. Caroline had been planning it for months, reaching out to everyone who'd been at the Montana facility or other Pure Minds locations. Over 30 former members showed up at the community center on a Saturday afternoon. Rose and I went together, both nervous about seeing people who'd been through similar trauma. The room was full of people ranging from teenagers to adults in their 30s. Some had been out of Pure Minds for years. Others had only escaped recently. We sat in a circle and people shared their recovery stories. One woman talked about thriving in her career as a social worker after years of intensive therapy. A man described still struggling with basic social interactions despite being out for 5 years. A younger guy shared how he'd attempted suicide twice, but was now stable and building a life. A girl my age talked about just starting her recovery journey and feeling overwhelmed by everything. Hearing all these different stories reinforced that healing wasn't linear or uniform. Some people recovered faster, some faced ongoing challenges, but everyone was surviving and finding their own path forward. During a break, several people who'd been at Montana with Rose came over to talk. They remembered her from the facility and were amazed by how well she was doing now. They asked about her FBI work and her upcoming baby. They told stories about the facility that made me grateful I'd never gone there. One woman said Rose's escape had given everyone hope that getting out was possible. After the event, Rose and I sat in her car for a while, processing everything we'd heard. She said seeing everyone's different recovery paths reminded her that there was no right way to heal. Some people needed more support. Some found their own way. What mattered was that we were all still here, still trying, still building lives despite what Pure Minds had done to us. We were facing the future together rather than alone, and that collective survival felt powerful, even when individual progress was messy and complicated. Magnus suggested I write a letter to Mom that I didn't have to send. He said sometimes getting feelings on paper helped sort through complicated emotions, even if nobody else ever saw the words. I sat at Dad's kitchen table with blank paper for an hour before I could start writing. The first draft was just angry. I listed every restriction she'd imposed and every year she'd stolen from my development. I wrote about the soundproofing and the blackout curtains and the 1920s textbooks. I wrote about thinking Rose was dead for 3 years. I wrote about the terror I felt when those Pure Minds evaluators said I needed Montana. Then I crumpled that version up because Magnus said the letter should help me process everything, not just vent rage. The second attempt tried to understand her perspective. She genuinely believed Pure Minds' ideology about protecting children from contamination. She thought isolation was love and restriction was safety. The cult had convinced her that modern society would destroy my mind, and she was saving me from that fate. Writing that part made me realize she was trapped in their manipulation, just like the kids at Montana were trapped in different ways. But understanding her reasoning didn't erase the damage she'd caused or make me ready for contact. Magnus read both versions during our next session and said they showed healthy processing of complex feelings. I could be angry about what she did while recognizing she believed her actions were protective. I could understand she was manipulated by cult ideology while still holding her accountable for choosing to follow their protocols. He asked if I wanted to send the letter or keep it private. I told him I wasn't ready for any contact with Mom and might never be. My recovery had to come first, and opening communication felt like it would set me back. He said that was a completely valid choice, and I could revisit the decision years from now if my feelings changed. For now, the letter served its purpose by helping me work through everything without needing her response or validation. 2 years after Rose showed up with the FBI, I'm living a life I couldn't have imagined during those first terrifying weeks. I earned my GED last spring after intensive studying and enrolled in community college classes for fall semester. I'm taking introductory psychology because I want to help other survivors eventually. Rose's baby was born healthy 3 months ago, and I'm learning to be a good uncle. I visit twice a week to help with feedings and diaper changes, and watching her daughter experience normal childhood feels healing in unexpected ways. Dad and I rebuilt our relationship into something solid based on honesty instead of fear. He's been consistently supportive of my recovery, and we talk openly about what happened without him making excuses. I still see Magnus monthly because recovery is ongoing work, not something that finishes. I attend support group regularly, where I share my progress and listen to others at different stages of their healing. I have real friends now, including Galen and people from my educational program who understand my background. I work part-time at the library shelving books and helping patrons find materials. The job gives me structure and income while letting me work at my own pace. I still have hard days when crowds overwhelm me, or technology feels too complicated, or I realize how much normal experience I missed. But the good days outnumber the difficult ones now. I have genuine hope for my future and actual plans that feel achievable. The isolation and trauma will always be part of my story, and I'll probably always struggle with some effects. But those experiences don't define my entire life anymore. I'm building something new that's mine, and for the first time since this all started, I actually believe I'm going to be okay.